All right, Vietnam. As is the case of Korea, the United States fought a long war with Vietnam. The earliest inhabitants we know of were the Viets. That's where we get the name Vietnam. It comes from the Viets. Vietnam is a long, long, thin country, but it's separated from Cambodia by a tall, very difficult to climb mountains. So that's what has kept, in fact, it's so difficult that Vietnam and Cambodia have never been united into one country. That they've always been split again because of these mountains. But Vietnam's coastline is very long, and the coastline pretty close to China. But you can get from China to Vietnam without going into the ocean, because Vietnam has a border with China. China influenced Vietnam from the beginning. The earliest, again, the Vietnamese began to farm, and they had to struggle against China. When the Chinese first invaded, the Viets went into the mountains, and from the mountains, that is the mountains that separate them from Cambodia, they'd resist. Now, here is something that a lot of men my age could understand. This is where the Viets learned how to fight guerrilla warfare. Hit the Chinese and vanish. And they were ideally suited to this because Vietnam contains a whole lot of jungle, and a person, even before the invention of the gun, could hide in the dense undergrowth of the jungle, strike at the enemy and vanish. Strike a soldier, an enemy soldier down, and then vanish. The Vietnamese first did this against the Chinese, did it against the Chinese several times, did it against the Mongolians, and then finally did it against the United States. In all cases, was able to win for them. Now, the Viets eventually overcame the Chinese, but it took a long time. It took actually about 1,000 years. For 1,000 years, Vietnam was controlled by China. The Vietnamese people, now Vietnam is a tropical country, and well, I feel like I ought to say it because this is proven to be factual. People from the tropical countries tend to be more primitive than people from temperate countries. And again, I said this to one class one time, and a young lady came up to me after class and said, "Yes, I know this to be true." That woman, by the way, was from Jamaica. But anyway, these people, well, people from temperate climates know they have a short period of time in which they have to plant their seed, a short period of time to plow, and then a short period of time to harvest. Tropical people, whenever I feel like it, I'll plant. Whenever I feel up to it, I'll harvest. You know, any time is good enough. Maybe that has a lot to do with it. I don't know what it is, but tropical peoples tend to be less civilized and less industrious than peoples from temperate climates. Anyway, the Vietnamese were a tropical people. Now, they also tend to be less civilized, and the Chinese decided they would try to civilize these people by a process known as sinification, or you might say Chinification. You know, the Chinese tried to Chinaize or Chinify the Viets, and this process took a long time. So basically, they were trying to make the Vietnamese people like Chinese. Now, one particular issue that your book mentions, and I'm going to mention it too, the Vietnamese young people had a habit of, if a man and a woman liked each other, they'd just start living together without the benefit of a ceremony. The Chinese said, no, you really need to have a ceremony to make this a legal binding act, because supposing one of you dies, will the other one collect benefits? I mean, all kinds of benefits you get from actually going through a marriage ceremony. The Chinese tried to convince the people of Vietnam that they should have a ceremony before they started living together, and they finally convinced most of them. And I want to say this, I mean, I'm aware of how a lot of people today are living, and If I'm going to step on your toes, I'm going to. But your union will get more respect if you do have a ceremony before you start living together. Any of you want to contest that, your opinions are welcome. And generally, the more civilized people practice the idea of having a ceremony, and when they stop practicing it, their civilization goes downhill. Unions where you just simply start living together are easier to get out of than where you have a legally binding contract. The other partner has an easier time walking out. All right, I've said my piece. If any of you want to say anything, your views are welcome. All right, you all know what I think. But anyway, the Chinese eventually somewhat sinified the Vietnamese. Religiously, Buddhism, they started off worshiping nature spirits. And they were animistic. And when our soldiers went to Vietnam, we found in the deep jungles a lot of animistic people still there. But as was the case of other Southeast Asian people, the more civilized ones of them lived along the coast where they had ships, or ships came in and they would trade with other more civilized people. And the religions that became a big part of Vietnam were Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. In other words, the civilized ones abandoned their nature worship, abandoned their animism and shamanism, and became Buddhist, Taoist, or Confucian, depending. Now, the religion that took over the most was Buddhism, probably owing to the simple fact, and folks, some of you will see this on the test, what appeal did Buddhism have for these primitive-like peoples? Primitive people tend to be egalitarian. Buddhism was more egalitarian than Confucianism or Hinduism. So these people were attracted to Buddhism because it appeared to be, and actually was, more egalitarian than Hinduism or Confucianism. Taoism also came into this part of the world, but Taoism did not spread as much. Taoism never became the dominant religion of anywhere, possibly owing to the fact it seemed too extreme or too much into magic and wizardry. Some people are fascinated by that, but if you can say that Taoism took over anywhere, it would be Tibet. But even in Tibet, I'm not sure that Taoism was a dominant religion. Now, for those of you who want to write a paper on women, there was a woman in Vietnamese times, early Vietnam, who fought a long war against China. She lost. Just like in the case of Britain, there was a woman named Broadsea who fought a long war against the Romans, and she also lost. But she did a lot to get the Vietnamese men, to go into the jungles and take up guerrilla tactics and oppose the Chinese. And I had a female student do a paper on her one time, many years ago. But I'm not going to, except make passing mention of it. This will not be on the test. But the Vietnamese resisted the Chinese, again using guerrilla warfare. The Mongolians came to Vietnam. After conquering China, Kublai Khan sent an army to Mongolia. The Mongolians had initial success. But again, like the Muslims, the Mongolians fought from horseback. They were excellent cavalrymen. They used gunpowder even. But their type of fighting did not do well in the jungles of Vietnam. Like I say, initially, they conquered the Vietnamese. But then the Vietnamese resorted to their guerrilla tactics. And there's nothing more demoralizing an army would be marching along and all of a sudden the soldier dropped dead. Army marched along a few steps more and another soldier drops dead. The army marched along and everybody in the army that's left begins to wonder, which one of us is going to be next? Nothing more demoralizing to an army than to just be marching along and have its men being killed by an enemy they cannot see. Essentially, these Vietnamese would hurl spears at an enemy and vanish. Down the line, another spear would come flying out and the enemy nowhere to be seen. The enemy was never seen before. All they ever saw, the enemy was a spear that came at him, or the arrow that came at him, or the whatever else weapon they used. Poison darts even, maybe at times. Guerrilla warfare, and the Mongolians could not handle that. The Mongolians had really high casualties, and finally, the Mongolians left. But the Vietnamese rulers, when setting up their governments, they copied the Chinese. And they set up civil service exams. However, the difference was, in the case of the Japanese, only the nobility could take them. In the case of the Vietnamese, they were egalitarian. Anyone could take the exams. I don't know how they learned to read. Maybe they took them orally. I don't know. But anyway, in the case of the Vietnamese, anybody could take the exams. And, pardon me, I must say any man could. Not anybody, any man. Now, the women in Vietnam were more equal than they were in any other part of anywhere else in this part of the world. Whether it be Mongolia, Korea, Japan, their women were considered equal. Their women could own and inherit property. Their women could initiate divorce proceedings against their husbands, something that was not allowed much in the rest of the world. In the rest of that part of the world. But in Vietnam, women could decide to divorce their husbands if they wanted to. Again, their women were more equal than they were in Japan, Korea, or China. Again, you can decide for yourself whether that was bad or good. Now, Shintoism, the Japanese Shinto did not reach Vietnam and was not practiced in Korea either, and not in China. Shinto remained exclusively a Japanese religion. And I must say this, the Japanese have tended to be the least religious people in the face of the earth. And this has always been true to me down through history. But the reason I mention that was one of my nieces, when she was in college, was assigned to write a paper on Shinto, and she asked me for a little bit of help on it, and I gave her what help I could. The Shinto had less influence on most Japanese than other religions had on their people. All right. Now, having gone through that, I want to spend the rest of the time reviewing a little bit on questions some of you can expect to see. My bad, folk. See, I told you I couldn't get this computer online. And then it got online by itself after I left it alone, and I didn't know it. What that was telling you is the stock market opened.
Oh, good.
The stock market just now opened, and apparently the investors like the news because. All right. Anyway, I'll leave that. Leaving that. All right. One thing I want to emphasize: all of you will see some questions on the test about why did China, which was so far ahead of the rest of the world in technological advancement and in civilization, fall behind. And again, I think part of the problem was they were united, and that made it easier for some emperors who didn't know better to destroy what they built up. One or two bad emperors could destroy everything. But the emperors were influenced by their philosophers, much more so than was the case of Europe. And these Chinese philosophers convinced the emperors that banks led to greed, and greed was bad, and therefore you shouldn't have banks, you shouldn't have paper money, all of which, it turned out to be China's undoing. The Chinese began, the one thing that you'll learn in second semester, hopefully you will, the Chinese believed that they were better than everybody else and didn't need to learn from anybody. They might actually have been better than anyone else, but they didn't know you can fall behind quickly. All you got to do is decide we don't need to learn anything. I mean, the most primitive people on earth had one device that nobody else had. I'm talking about the Australian Aborigines had the boomerang. Nobody else had it. And so the rest of us, I mean, you learn from everybody, whomever, regardless. Even if you think you're better than they are, you can still learn something from them. Chu, Si, and Yang, Wang, Mang, the philosophies. Chu, Si, and Yang, they've, all right. Chu, Si believed that we should understand ourselves. Everything of Yang, Wang, Mang believed, no, we should understand the universe around us. That's something I did not mention. I'm going to mention it now. Chu, Si, understanding of self. Yang, Wang, Mang.
They spell it.
What's that?
They spell it.
Chu, Si, H-X-U-C-H-I, 2 words. And it's not pronounced, it's not spelled it's pronounced. I mean, oops. H. I'm lost now. H-X-U. Chu, Si. Not pronounced the way it's spelled. Now, Yang, Wang, Mang, that is pronounced the way it's spelled. Yang, Wang, Mang. All right. Hey, our names might seem funny to them, so I mean, none of that. Yes?
So what was, you said Chu, Si had understanding?
Chu, Si believed that we need to look inward, similar to our New Age, understand ourselves. And you can even compare him to Socrates, that the truth lies within everybody, and you can find it inside yourself. Now, don't quote me on that. That's not me speaking. And Yang Wang Mang said, no, the truth lies outside ourselves. We have to invest. We have to go outside ourselves to find truth. Now, one thing too I want to emphasize. When the Vietnamese were invaded by the Chinese, and then the Vietnamese later were invaded by the Americans, they both handled their enemies the same way and won in both cases. The answer to that is guerrilla warfare, which those jungles are really, really, really conducive to. Guerrilla warfare. And the American Army resorted to using Agent Orange to defoliate a lot of the jungles, and the Agent Orange has proven to be bad on the soldiers, for the soldiers who were exposed to it. All right. I mentioned this at the beginning of the chapter on India. It mentions India's dress style. Until the late 20th century, it changed little from ancient times to the middle of the 20th century. It basically loose-fitting and oftentimes light-colored dresses. The dress style that was ideally suited to India's hot climate. India is a subtropical to tropical country. All right, now, some of the things that you're all going to see, but the answers will be different, your choices. You'll see a multiple choice question. What did the Chinese invent? Gunpowder, the printing press, the wheelbarrow, the movable sail, the rudder, porcelain, silk, paper money, banking. Oh, I'm sure I might could think of some more, but hey, they made a lot of stuff, folk, that should have. All right, oh yes, I mentioned this last class. Which Chinese dynasty built the Grand Canal? The dynasty that united them after 400 years of chaos, the Sui dynasty. Built the Grand Canal, and hopefully you remember the Grand Canal joins which 2 rivers? Yellow and Yangtze rivers. Yes, there are 2 main rivers. The only problem with canals, they tend to freeze up in the winter time, but otherwise they're good for carrying large volumes of goods over land.
What was that?
What's that?
Like carry large volume.
Large volume of goods over land. In other words, one halfway horse, I mean, one horse and a half strong, can carry tons, can pull tons of weight. And all it takes, well, you can use two horses. They don't even have to be extra horses. Just horses who have seen better days but are still worth something. They can pull tons of weight. And again, it doesn't take teams of them. Now, why did Buddha, I mentioned this earlier, why did Buddhism appeal more to uncivilized peoples than, say, Hinduism?
More egalitarian?
Egalitarian is the word I want to use. Buddhism tends to be more egalitarian, and primitive peoples tend to be egalitarian. I'm not saying egalitarianism is all that great either. I mean, but nevertheless, it's to me, as you might can guess, I think that if a person is capable and can forge ahead, let that person forge ahead. And if a civilization is good and can forge ahead, let that civilization forge ahead. And the only way to do that, folk, I mean, it's like I'm doing it. I've not done this the other class yet, but I must do it today. If you want to get certain levels of the ocean higher, you've got to build a container. And that way, this part of the ocean can get higher than the rest of it in the sea of humanity. In other words, folk, this may sound hard and tough. The civilized people have to separate themselves from the uncivilized. Just like in Europe, the nobility wound up separating themselves from the unnoble. But the earliest ruins we find, the ruins at Çatalhöyük and ruins of the Indus Valley, seem to show that everybody was equal. But as man progressed, or as time went on, as time went on, some people fell behind, and some people still remained intelligent. And intelligent, we have to separate ourselves from the unintelligent. And they did this by setting up social classes and building walls to separate themselves. Now again, we now have a globalistic movement that I think will lead to all of us becoming uncivilized again if it becomes the norm. Instead of the civilized bringing the uncivilized up, the uncivilized will bring the civilized down. If you don't like what I'm saying, hey, I don't like it either. If you find it offensive, I even find it offensive. But I think it's true. All right. Again, who built the Great Wall? Well, the Chinese, to keep the uncivilized out. But the British built two walls, Offa's Wall and Hadrian's Wall. Well, Hadrian's Wall was actually built by the Roman Emperor Hadrian to keep my own uncivilized Scottish ancestors out. All right. This one. Okay. Oh, yes. Folk, which two consecutive Chinese dynasties tried to help the poor? These are two dynasties who ruled, well, I say consecutive. There actually was a period of chaos between the two of them. But there was two dynasties that tried to help the poor, and they ruled almost consecutively. Which two was it?
Tang.
The Tang and the Song. Yeah, but between them there was a couple generations of chaos called interregnum, where there was no powerful. The Tang and the Song. And the result was disaster for both sides. I mean, folk, again. Well, does history repeat itself? If it does, this country's in deep trouble. If it does, if history repeats itself. All right. Oh yeah, now here's one. Who was able to civilize the people who conquered? I mean, they were conquered by uncivilized conquerors. Who civilized their uncivilized barbarian conquerors? Two peoples did this. Rome did it and China did it. China civilized its uncivilized Mongolians who conquered them. The Romans eventually, slowly and gradually, Europeans civilized their uncivilized German conquerors. Europe did it. China did it. All right, which one of these people, here's a multiple choice one, collapsed never to rise again? India, China, Rome, Rome. Collapsed never to rise, even though the Christianity that was started during Roman times did not fall, but to the Roman Empire fell, never to rise up again. Went into a dark age, from which they did come out of. All right. What kept the South Asian people from uniting? Several things. Geography, mainly it was geography. Plus there was language barriers, plus mainly it was water and mountains. Ocean and mountains. Water and mountains, between the oceans and mountains, and language barriers too. The peoples of Southeast Asia were never able to unite. Know what the civil service exam was? Determine who gets government positions based on test scores. Oh yes, in India they had a dynasty called the Mauryan dynasty. It was the last time that any dynasty was able to unite all of India. Founded by Chandragupta Maurya, who was a follower of Alexander the Great. It lasted a few hundred years and then fell about the same time the Roman Empire was declining, and about the same time the Han dynasty was declining. And there was a parallel history, folk, and a lot of it might have been due to climate change. All right, with that, okay, I want to say this too about civilization have fallen. North America and Africa both had civilizations that fell, and in both their cases were never able to rise again. North America, the Indians in North America once were more civilized than they were when the Europeans found them. Africa, the same thing. Africa contributed more to civilization than we once thought, and yet they became uncivilized over time and never were able to become civilized again. Went into a dark age from which they did not come out of.